Hi everyone, welcome to session 7 where we look at communication and the importance of conflict in the office. So as you all watch this scene, we see Michael Scott getting involved in a dispute with his two employees, Oscar and Angela. Although we may not have Michael Scott in our office to comedically facilitate our discussions, we do have leaders often faced with facilitating complex discussions and situations in our organizations. Throughout this presentation, we'll be using these topics as a lens to address some of the communication skills needed when managing conflict while comparing these conflict resolution approaches throughout the scene.
As you go through this week's material and discussions, keep in mind these guiding questions. How did Michael Scott play a part in facilitating this discussion? Thinking through the 4 communication skills essential to facilitating, how did Scott perform during this disagreement with Angela and Oscar? Which of the 5 approaches to conflict resolution would you have selected for Angela and Oscar's conflict, and why? How would you have used these approaches in a recent conflict you have experienced?
At the core of every team, we have communication. By definition, communication is viewed as a transaction of information. But of course, within a team, it's way more than a simple transmission of a message from a sender to a recipient. We often use verbal and nonverbal cues, and we change our methods depending on who we're talking to. For example, your communication around your coworkers is likely very different than when your manager is around. As we go through this section, think about Pam's suggestion of a compromise and what communication skills did she potentially lack to get the buy-in from the other members. With both verbal and nonverbal cues, as well as outside factors such as gender and the different biases members could have, it's important to clarify your language to avoid misunderstandings. In order to improve these communication methods, it requires building trust, facilitating team meetings, and constantly developing these well thought out skills. We can compare this to the scene where Michael is trying to utilize the mediator's tool chest, but we notice Oscar and Angela immediately closed off and quick to respond because they recognize that Michael is not the person who could help their conflict. By earning trust and creating a psychologically safe environment for your team, they are more likely to come together and make better decisions. The first basis of building a foundation when communicating is having that emotional intelligence to connect with your team members. As stated in the textbook, emotional intelligence is the ability to solve emotional problems. It's an important aspect of communication in team discussions, and it's associated with enhanced levels of team performance. It's comprised of self-awareness, empathy, emotional regulation, and relationship management. When we are able to recognize and manage our emotions, that's an important aspect of a team's communication. In this scene, we see Michael having the relationship management aspect to express himself clearly and giving Oscar and Angela the space to share their perspectives while using productive language. We see this lack of emotional regulation when Oscar and Angela are fighting in front of the poster on why it should and should not stay up. With emotional intelligence as a foundation, there are also supplemental communication skills needed when facilitating a discussion. Some of the key communication attributes when facilitating a discussion come from asking questions, listening actively, giving constructive feedback, and again, managing our feelings. As we talk about facilitating a discussion or conflict, that facilitator needs to remain neutral as a third party, keep an open and collaborative climate, manage those disruptive behaviors, and evaluate the group's progress. We see Michael Scott listening and encouraging Oscar and Angela to focus on the I statement and to not use judgment, letting their emotions get in the way. In the beginning of the scene, Toby explains that all he does is listen and that these things just have a way of working themselves out. We see Toby as staying neutral and emotionally intelligent, and we can compare his behavior to that of Michael Scott's biased behavior once he finds out that he too could be a winner in the win-win-win scenario. Although his attempt to facilitate this conflict seems effective on the surface, Michael Scott's lack of self-awareness and his biases, of course, leads to more conflict within the team, which is a natural part of a team's process.
And that leads us to our next topic, managing conflict. As Dom mentioned earlier, conflict is a natural part of the team process. To understand how conflict fits into this process, we first need to understand if conflict is normal. Is conflict normal? Yes. In fact, conflict is not only normal, but it is also a healthy aspect of any team dynamic. Levy describes conflict as the process by which people or teams perceive that others have taken action that which has a negative effect on their interest. Why is conflict normal, you may ask? Healthy conflict in a team promotes open communication. Teams that have established psychological safety amongst its members are able to have constructive dialogue sessions. It is important for us to also understand how conflict occurs within a team. Table 7.1 from our textbook lists out several healthy and unhealthy sources of conflict for you to explore. With an understanding of how conflict occurs, we can explore how to resolve it. To do this, we will view conflict resolution through Levy's two-dimensional lens. This is comprised of the distribution dimension, or one of selfishness and assertiveness, and the integration dimension, one of cooperation and concern of others. In the scene from The Office, we see Oscar and Angela concerned only about their own outcomes of the conflict. When Michael gets involved, we may first assume that he cares about the outcomes for both Angela and Oscar, approaching this from an integration dimension. But upon realizing that he is more concerned with being perceived as the problem solver, he is actually following the distribution dimension of conflict resolution. Pam is approaching conflict resolution via the integration dimension, as we see she is truly concerned about the outcome that Oscar and Angela will have. There are several approaches to conflict resolution shown across the two dimensions in Figure 7.1 from our textbook. We see the ideal approach of collaboration is made possible when parties have a high degree of cooperativeness and assertiveness. Any successful approach to conflict resolution involves some type of negotiation. The perspective of the participants is an important factor. Ask yourself, do they have a win-lose or a win-win perspective? The goal of negotiating is to develop an integrative win-win approach where both sides benefit. A key to this approach is enabling each side to realize that they have compatible interests. To do this, Fisher, Urey, and Patton have created the 5-step structure for negotiation, shown here on the slide.
Some key takeaways for leaders after this presentation is 1. When creating a psychologically safe environment by being emotionally intelligent, that is a key to communicating within your team. 2nd, for leaders facilitating a discussion or conflict, it's important to remain neutral as a third party and keep an open and collaborative climate. Lastly, in any organization, it's healthy for your team to have conflict, as it's not always negative, but it's important to keep a structure to these conversations. Thank you for watching.